Welcome back in. It's the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. Very, very busy Tuesday of coverage for us at Lions247.com. We spent much of this afternoon on campus at the Pagula Ice Arena because Beaver Stadium's still not available to us right now with all the renovations. But it was James Franklin's first press conference since the Orange Bowl post game. So the first of this very eventful offseason. Naturally, there was plenty to catch up on with him. The hiring of Jim Knowles from Ohio State, the departure of longtime assistant Ja'Juan Seider, which has happened since we last spoke to you here on the Lions247 podcast. And there was a lot more with James Franklin as well. We have the entire video over at Lions247.com. We're going to have a lot more content coming from that over at the site as well. After Franklin, we actually had a chance to catch up with essentially every member of Penn State's 2024 freshman class. They're now in year 2 on campus. Most of them are redshirt freshmen. A few of them are sophomores after seeing some game action last year. But all of them have plenty to prove in Penn State uniforms. And we had a chance to go across the room over the course of a couple hours this afternoon and breaking things down with many of them. Daniel Gowan and myself here on this episode of the podcast will discuss that a bit. But I want to encourage you to head over to Lions247.com because we're really just scratching the surface from those conversations, going through our transcripts and video. There'll be a lot more at Lions247.com. But as I said, Daniel, we have a lot to discuss right here. And we have a lot of writing to do, and there's going to be deeper dives in a lot of the topics that we address. But this Penn State offseason, if you want to call it that, I know a lot of people don't believe in the word in college football anymore because it is so eventful. But here we are now. We're about 5 weeks away from this team getting back on the practice field for their college football spring practices. That'll come at the end of March. And we're now 4 weeks away from them last playing in a matchup against Notre Dame down in South Florida, kind of in between those two parts of the calendar year, Daniel. And we're reminded every year how much a team changes between those 2 points, the coaching staff, the personnel. Today was a good reminder, and we'll begin with Ja'Juan Seider because he was a familiar face for many of us, including those on the beat for the last 7 seasons as running backs coach here for Penn State. Made the move. I think many of us, knowing he was a South Florida native, knowing his roots to that region, he had bounced around a little bit in college football. We didn't think he had an expiration date of 7 seasons here at Penn State. I've been saying since probably year 3 that he's been here longer than many of us thought. But he is, in fact, leaving. James Franklin confirmed he's moving on. We haven't heard anything official from Notre Dame end, but that's all the reporting that has happened since Sunday, Daniel, that he's going to be Notre Dame's next running backs coach. We'll get the details on that. Eventually, I'd imagine Ja'Juan Seider will find himself in front of a microphone to discuss his reason for making the move. But James Franklin had some things to say about it. We also heard from some young running backs about it. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can just start Sunday where it felt like this offseason. You talk about all the change that happens, and we had Tom Allen leaving, Jim Knowles coming in, the transfer portal flurry, all of that stuff. And, I think that after the Jim Knowles introductory news conference, I feel like we all kind of thought that we can take a breath, we can take a step back, we can relax a little bit. And then it's Super Bowl Sunday morning and the news starts, leaking out. I think it was Pete Thamel from ESPN had that Notre Dame was targeting Ja'Juan Seider, and then our colleague Matt Zenitz at 247 Sports, put a little bit of a finer point on it with Ja'Juan Seider, leaving Penn State. But yeah, I mean, I think the way that you laid it out with Seider's 7-year career and how a lot of people thought that it might not necessarily last that long. When I joined the beat 4 years ago, it was a thing where at that point the conversation was kind of like what you said, that he's been here a while already, that maybe some people didn't necessarily see that. So I mean, I think that it was a little bit of a surprise. It sounded like Penn State's young running backs were surprised by it too, but James Franklin made the point that because of the NFL cycle, the NFL coaching carousel, that changes the calendar a little bit for college football coaching. I know that Seider isn't going to an NFL team, but all of this stuff is related on the carousel, and it's just the nature of the beast at this point, and how football, both NFL and college works.
And well, the point is, I think that he replaced a coach who went to the NFL, right?
Yes.
Dalen McCullough, moving on to the NFL after spending time with Notre Dame. So it's that carousel that you talked about, the domino effect. Like last year, all of a sudden Nick Saban retires, and Washington's great program is brought down to the ground because their coaching staff's in Tuscaloosa all of a sudden. That was late on the calendar. And James Franklin did call it a bit problematic to have to be involved in a coaching search at this stage. It reminds me a little bit, Daniel, of a couple of years ago. I think it was mid-February. John Scott Jr. got that call from the Detroit Lions. He left as defensive line coach. The difference here versus then is you don't have that internal candidate that's a clear option to promote. They ended up going that direction with Deion Barnes after interviewing some external candidates. This time around, Daniel, before we talk about what the next coach would inherit, I mean, James Franklin said it himself, this might be the most attractive running back job in America. And I think there's a case to be made that for any coach who's coming here to know that you can hang your hat on showing up to the office and having Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen waiting for you and waiting to take those directions, that's a huge plus. Now, if you were to be replacing Ja'Juan Seider and Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen, we'd be having an entirely different conversation about where this running back room is. But you got two 1,000-yard backs returning. They can end up number 1 and number 2 on the all-time rushing list for the Nittany Lions when it's all said and done in their careers. Then you work your way through some of the developmental pieces. We liked where Cam Wallace was trending before his injury last year. We like the versatility of Quentin Martin Jr. Corey Smith showed some good things. They really like Tyke Hayes, who just brought in. I'm forgetting a name or two because that's the way it works.
Jabri Wallace-Coleman.
Yeah, Jabri Wallace-Coleman is not quite yet on campus, but a former Georgia commit out of Philadelphia. He'll come to campus trying to make his move as well. But, Daniel, when you start at the top and say Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen are here waiting for the next coach, James Franklin didn't say they'll be in the interview process. They're not going to be on Zoom calls with him because he doesn't want them riding the emotional roller coaster that can come with a coaching search. But he says he is not going to touch a candidate if he doesn't think they're a good fit, if he doesn't think they're going to be a good thing for Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen. So this is a little bit different in terms of just filling a position coach because you're filling a position room that has arguably two of your all-timers at this position for Penn State as they go into year 4.
Yeah, I thought James Franklin made an interesting point, and I need to go back and listen to it and read it again to really nail down some of the nuances. But I thought what he said about the return on investment was really interesting. And he made the point where, if you want to get in with an ascending coach, that, you might not necessarily, because of where this team is, you don't necessarily have that luxury, to be like the coach that you can be in a year or two. Like they need someone now. But then, looking for someone who is established and can do things now, that also has its own, set of, complications that comes with it. So I'm interested to see what Penn State can do. But I do agree with what James Franklin said, that this is a very attractive running back job, even beyond what you have in the room in terms of Singleton, Allen, Cam Wallace, Quentin Martin, Corey Smith, then Tyke Hayes, Jabri Wallace-Coleman coming in. You've got Messiah Mickens on board for 2026. You've already got Kaman Spell on board for 2027.
Yeah.
I mean, the assembly line, the pipeline, the factory, whatever you want to call it, has really been humming for Penn State. And so,
can we say one more thing, Daniel? When you talk about the assembly line, the finished product is that guy holding the Lombardi Trophy on Sunday night, Saquon Barkley with his big smile. I mean, right now business is booming for the Penn State running back brand, and it's a different ambassador in that room. But whoever puts on that logo is arguably going to be in one of, if not the best positions of their career to this point.
Exactly. And so it is going to be really interesting to see who Penn State can find, who wants this job, who does James Franklin want to have this job, and who ultimately accepts it. But I think when you look at this group, they're in a good position. I think that having two veteran guys like Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen, who have probably seen just about everything at this point that the sport has to offer, I think that it puts the room in a good position, in terms of finding a new hire there.
We got a story up earlier this week breaking down several names to know as Penn State looks to replace Ja'Juan Seider. I'll just note we all enjoyed our time covering Ja'Juan Seider. I don't think there's a lot of people around this region in the community of Happy Valley who will speak ill of Seider in his 7 years here. We'll see what he does at Notre Dame, assuming that is the next step. Still waiting for the official word out of South Bend, but James Franklin confirming he's moving on from the Nittany Lions now, and we'll see what lies ahead at this role. But among those names, Daniel, one of them, and this is kind of speaking to the fluidity of how college football is working right now. We saw with the defensive coordinator search, DeAnton Lynn got a contract extension at USC. Demir Scholl is a name I had on this list. He's considered a rising running backs coach at Rutgers. A lot of success of late there with Kyle Monungai. He just got an extension today, just so happens. 3 years. I wonder why Rutgers may have been motivated. I don't think Penn State's the only team poking their head around there. And, you look through some of the other names I put on this list, it kind of varies. There's other up-and-comers. There's guys who are a little more established. You got someone who's connected with Andy Kotelnicki, Jonathan Wallace, running backs coach at Kansas there for the last several seasons. Continuity in place there, perhaps, if you could bring him on board. And then a guy like Stan Drayton, he's got history in the NFL. He's been the running backs coach for Urban Meyer national championship squads with the Florida Gators and the Ohio State Buckeyes. He was Temple's head coach last year. He was also fired last year. And so there are a lot of different options. Guys who are in their 50s and have been head coaches, guys who are in their young 30s and maybe have never experienced what it's like to be in a building like Penn State. That doesn't exactly sound like what James Franklin's looking for right now when he talked about that return on investment. Doesn't want someone learning on the job. And he also threw this our way as well, so take it for what it's worth. He said some recruiting shops in the Northeast and Big Ten territory would be a plus for this position as well. I know some people were like, well, they got to find a Florida running backs coaches. You got to get a Florida recruiter in this job. I think they're looking for a little bit more than just one trait or all the traits. And there's many to look at with this running back. When there is something to report, we will do that at Lions247.com. Before we shift gears, though, Daniel, I mentioned Quentin Martin, Corey Smith. These are guys that when we look beyond the Nick Singleton, Katron Allen era, they could be very important pieces. We did hear from them today. We heard from all those freshmen, like I said. What stood out is you have a story up at Lions247.com breaking down the circumstances, including the insight from these guys.
Yeah, both Martin and Smith said that they were surprised by the move, but they both leaned back on some variation of, it's a business. It's just business. This is how things work. I think Corey Smith said that, or I think both of them said this actually, that this doesn't change what the end goal is. And so, I think that it's, kind of a tough position for, those young players to be in. It's like, we're not hearing from Nick Singleton or Katron Allen about, this move. You're hearing from a couple guys who have not been on campus that long. And, Quentin Martin said his relationship with Seider goes all the way back to his freshman year of high school, which is 5 years ago at this point. But, you have two younger guys kind of being spokespeople for that running back room. But, they both, I think, handled it pretty well. And, I kind of, liked their mindset in terms of what they were saying. I mean, it was very human, I think. Quentin Martin said that he was, he's a little bit hurt. They both said that they appreciated hearing, from Ja'Juan Seider, who called them, I think, after the news broke. They both said that they understand, and they were both asked about the transfer portal, and they both said that's something that's not on their radar. I think that Corey Smith said that he has a vision for how his career goes, and it involves being at Penn State. So, I think that stuff can change pretty quickly. That's just how college football is right now. But I think that those two guys handled things pretty maturely, and I appreciated the insight. I went back and dug up some quotes from when we first got to talk to them out at the Fiesta Bowl at the end of December, and they both spoke really glowingly of Ja'Juan Seider, and so that this is something that probably is tough for them. But it's nature of the game that these circumstances change. If you want to go far in this sport, you're going to have to deal with things like this, and this is just one of those things.
I'm pretty certain that when those guys were told you got to show up to this media availability next week, they didn't think they'd have to be answering questions about whether they'd enter the transfer portal because Ja'Juan Seider had left campus. So kudos to them, because that's a hell of an introduction to what we do as beat reporters, but I thought they both handled themselves pretty well. I think Corey Smith, by the way, something that kind of stuck out to me, and probably a lot of people will be happy to hear this, is in that room, he says the message from Nick Singleton and Katron Allen is to not let yourself be consumed by this moment and look at the bigger picture, because they, in the words of Corey Smith, they have both gone on a, quote, journey with Ja'Juan Seider. They showed up here as freshmen 4 years ago and in January of 2022, and they just come off that huge college football playoff run. There's so many things in that relationship that we're not privy to, we're not aware of, that have gone on the last several years. So if those guys are trying to extend that message, Corey Smith says, he had a relationship with Ja'Juan Seider, but it pales in comparison to what those guys have. So we'll see what happens. I think a big thing is going to be getting the next voice in that room, hearing from them, and then spending a spring practice period with that new position coach, because that spring window, that spring portal window will open come late April, and that'll be another opportunity for players to explore their options if they choose to. But between now and then, this running back room will get a chance to learn from a new coach and get a feel for that new coach. And we'll break that all down as we learn who it is over at Lions247.com. Let's jump over to the other new coach that has already been announced. That was a couple weeks ago. Jim Knowles on board as defensive coordinator. And obviously this was considered a huge move by Penn State, not just James Franklin, but athletic director Pat Kraft and the university at large, as they were willing to spend more than $3 million annually to bring in the defensive coordinator who helped Ohio State win a national championship last year. #1 defensive scoring, #1 defense in total yards. Now he's wearing that Nittany Lions logo. We met him last week during a press conference. And now James Franklin, for the first time, Daniel, had a chance to peel back the curtain a bit. I thought he peeled it back more than we probably anticipated regarding how things went with Jim Knowles. And to answer the question that I know a lot of people in Columbus were probably wondering, according to James Franklin, there was zero contact with Jim Knowles until 2 days after the national championship. That Thursday, 2 days after Ohio State had beaten Notre Dame to win the national title, around 5:40 a.m., James Franklin says his phone rings, he gets on a phone call, and by the end of that phone call, whether it was with Jim Knowles or someone representing Jim Knowles, he felt like they were in a realistic position to maybe pull off prying him away from Columbus. We know that by the time the weekend rolled around, there seemed to be a lot of smoke in the direction of Penn State, and by the time the weekend ended, there were reports across the country that Penn State was the destination for Knowles. I thought it was funny, though. James Franklin told us today, no, when those reports were going out, I was freaking out because it was not a done deal. There was no signed contract. And in fact, he was worried that those reports of a done deal were going to scare off the actual finalization of this thing. It does reach the finish line that next Monday. They announced things. We're 2 weeks beyond that point. Jim Knowles is well situated now in State College. He'll be on the practice field at the end of next month. But Daniel, when we got to hear from James Franklin himself, I think it was cool to hear about some of those tense moments. But what stood out to me most was that he said there have been times in his career with Penn State, before Penn State, where you got to replace somebody. You have to find a coach and you have a dream list. But normally, the dream list doesn't go very far for you because you got to work within reality. He says dream lists are now applicable at Penn State because of the support they're getting for the last couple of years. And I think that's got to be absolute beauty to the ears of anyone listening right now who wants Penn State to be able to build a national championship contending program in the arms race we all call college football.
Definitely. I think that was a key theme from James Franklin. I don't think he said the A word. I don't think he said alignment today.
No.
But he was alluding to that a lot, and he gave a lot of credit to Neely Bendapudi and Pat Kraft, the president and athletic director here at Penn State, and he said the commitment has been, quote, phenomenal from them. And I think that's big for Penn State, for where this program wants to go, where it wants to be, to have that sort of commitment and be able to have a problem. Your defensive coordinator leaves. He was a good defensive coordinator for a good unit. How do you upgrade? And then to have the resources to actually do that, I think that, like we've talked about, that sends a little bit of a message to college football. I also thought that James Franklin threw it in there that Jim Knowles had all intentions of going to Ohio State celebration, and Franklin was, I think, kind of like, yeah, go, like, because he said there wasn't a deal yet. These timeline things are always a little interesting, and I thought I did appreciate that insight from Franklin about when things were or weren't signed and what the circumstances were. So I just think that this is a big get for Penn State. I think that I'm really curious what it looks like in practice. because you have Franklin talking about the need to modify some things this offseason in the spring in terms of winter workouts, and then modifying workloads for particular players once spring practice rolls around. But then you combine that with needing to install a new defense under Jim Knowles. And I think that there's going to be some juggling that is going on. I think that from the mental side, I think this is probably going to be a pretty busy offseason for that defense, especially like you laid out. I mean, the season ended a month ago Sunday, and then we're talking about 5 weeks or whatever until spring ball starts, and it's a very condensed window, especially coming off a 16-game season. So we'll see what this looks like for Penn State, but I think it's going to be busy. But I think that a lot of things in this program are all pushing in the right direction.
Because we are coming off of literally like a 3-hour media session at Penn State facilities, there's so many things floating above my head right now. I'm going to pluck one of them because you mentioned it. There will be a ramification of that extended postseason run where Penn State's involved in on-field action until mid-January. That's not normal. So they are actually going to be condensed on the winter workout schedule. It sounded like James Franklin was saying more like 6 instead of the 8. It sounded like there could be some adjustments made to the spring practice schedule, although James Franklin says we can all count on being in Beaver Stadium on April 26th. I know there's been some concern about the spring game happening in various campuses. We'll see what that looks like precisely, but still looking at a blue-white weekend event there. Daniel, looking at Jim Knowles one more time, I thought the big thing that James Franklin really tried to get across was not just that I guess not just that the administration was able to send a message on Penn State's point, but I think really he felt like the fan base should be seeing this and having a realization in their own right. And I think he probably also thinks there's maybe a trickle effect or domino effect where people see the buy-in from the top. Maybe they're more willing to buy in or to lock in, as they've been saying lately, whether that means with their checkbooks or just locking in as a fan. But there's all sorts of ways now where anyone can kind of impact roster success, right? If you're a fan, you got a little bit of money to put aside, and for a football team, all of a sudden you could be helping them bring in a receiver, hypothetically. And so I think James Franklin tries to make it really relational with the fans on a move like this. I think a message was sent to this locker room, though, too. Speaking to a couple of those members of the 2024 class, they haven't been around long, but they said that they got the sense that it showed this university will do whatever it takes to put them in a position to compete for a national championship when you bring in someone like Jim Knowles. So message sent to the fan base, message sent to your own team. Now you got to actually scheme it up, coach it up, and go play good defense on the field this fall. But those were some of our takeaways from Knowles and the move and James Franklin talking about it. Full story up at Lions247.com. One player that Jim Knowles will not have on his roster to work with is Aman Vanover. We were under the understanding that he was appealing to the NCAA. Not appealing. He was trying to get that extra year of eligibility through a waiver for the NCAA. It would be year 6 for him if it were to happen. There was some hopeful nature to Penn State on this during the process, but we got confirmation on Tuesday that it did not work out in their favor. Aman Vanover turning attention toward the NFL preparation, coming off a season in which he played the 3rd highest total among defensive ends behind Abdul Carter and Denai Dennis-Sutton, who of course were the starters. He played more than 400 snaps as a 5th-year senior. Daniel, he had a really strong performance in the postseason, and he's a guy that he wanted to be back. They would have loved to have him back. The complexion of this defensive end situation probably looks quite different if you have him back. He's played 45 games, but knowing what we know now and the curtain seemingly closing on his college career, this means more opportunity, more responsibility for guys like Max Granville, potentially someone like Anai White coming in from Texas A&M. And really, you take your pick of some of those young, unproven players. And Malachi Williams, someone that we spoke with today, very confident in what he thinks he can do off the edge. But once again, it's great to have Denai Dennis-Sutton back. You got a 7th-year guy in Smith Vilbert back, and you like some of these young pieces. But I think it's really important, and hopefully you don't feel the absence too much next year. But Aman Vanover was one of those overlooked pieces of a really strong defense the last couple of years when he was out there and doing his thing in a rotational role.
Yeah, I mean, Vanover is that type of player that if you want to win a championship, like you have to have guys like that. You have to have, especially at that position, you have to have guys that will come in, behind your studs, behind your starters, and might not have the same skill set as a Abdul Carter or Denai Dennis Sutton, but has that motor and that hustle, and is and has the talent to still make some plays. I think that that's always what really stood out, for me for watching Vanover, is that he would just, when he'd be out there, he would just kind of be in the middle of things. I think it was in the first game that we all covered together with me at Lions247 at Beaver Stadium, where they were playing Ohio, and I called a Vanover, I think, strip sack or something along those lines. And that's sort of the player that he was. But you look at what this does to the picture, to the outlook along the defensive line, and it's going to look a lot different next year. We talked about that the team always looks different, but in terms of returning players, you've got Denai Dennis Sutton on the edge, and Zane Durant on the interior as your guys who really did handle big time workloads last year and are coming back. You've got a lot of guys who are moving on. I know you mentioned Smith Vilbert coming back as someone who was, I think, probably behind Vanover in that rotation. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity and a lot of competition. And talking to these freshmen today, confidence was, I think, a pretty common theme. You talked about it with Malachi Williams. I got to spend a little bit of time with him too. Kind of a man of few words, but I thought was really thoughtful and laid things out. It's not defensive end, but Xavier Gilliam, defensive tackle. He had a similar sort of confidence where they all see these guys leaving. They all know what the depth chart looks like. They all saw how the depth chart changed over the course of last year when you talk about different injuries and departures. So they know that there is going to be an opportunity there. And I think that it's a really good carrot for a lot of these younger guys to, go as they go through these winter workouts in the spring. So this competition is going to be a lot of fun. I think that Penn State's recruited well along the line, but we'll see. Some of these guys are going to have to step up.
Yeah. Unfortunate for Aman Vanover. I know some frustration out there because the appeal, I keep saying the appeals, the waiver application process in the NCAA is very difficult to wrap your head around case by case basis. But Vanover's career comes to a close. Really strong role player over the course of his career coming out of New Jersey. We'll see what lies in store for him. Add him to that list of NFL hopefuls in this 2025 class outgoing from the Nittany Lions. Let's finish up with some top takeaways, Daniel, from that opportunity to hear from a lot of these young Penn State players. It's a group that last year wasn't counted on a ton like that 2022 class was during the Rose Bowl run. It's not like we saw a ton of these players making key plays in the biggest moments of a semifinal run, but at the same time, they were out there. You had Luke Reynolds as your number 2 tight end for much of the season. He comes up with the key trick play late in that game at Minnesota to help put the finishing touches on that one. DeJon Lane, although it didn't really materialize to the point we thought it might, he ends up being a piece for you beyond those starters at safety and a guy that you need to turn to at times. And you go through position by position. There's some interesting pieces where guys didn't even practice much last year because of injuries. So we had a lot of varied opportunities to hear some kind of catch-up conversations and to be able to pass them along here on the podcast and over at Lions247.com. Again, Daniel, I want to reiterate, we're scratching the surface. There's a lot. I mean, there's hours of transcriptions we got to go through. We have a lot more coming our way. But Liam Andrews, Kari Jackson, Peter Gonzalez, those were 3 names we had circled going into this event because each of them had some shroud of mystery over them coming off of 2024 with injury issues. We can give you some fresh light on that one. Liam Andrews, Kari Jackson both told us they are going to be good to go for spring practices. Liam Andrews last year was in recovery mode throughout his freshman year, former top 100 overall lineman on the defensive side, playing defensive tackle. He is chomping at the bit to get out there and play on the practice field for Penn State finally as a redshirt freshman. And then Kari Jackson, unfortunately, this was back-to-back years where he missed a ton of time due to injuries. I think he only played 1 or 2 games as a senior in the high school level up in Detroit. And then last year wasn't available for any of Penn State's matchups as a freshman after competing in spring practice and suffering an undisclosed injury during preseason camp. I believe we saw him in a sling in early September. He told us today he'll be out there for spring practice. And then the other one, Peter Gonzalez, he did not give us any clarity one way or the other. So we got to stay tuned on that one. He's saying he's working with the staff to put himself in the best position possible, but he suffered an injury during preseason camp last year, ultimately cost him the entire season. Hopefully not much beyond that, but that's where we are with those three guys. With that out of the way, Daniel, we think Grunkemeyer suddenly becomes a much bigger name with Bo Perbula off to Missouri. That was the case in December. They rode with him as their number 2 quarterback option throughout those playoffs. Didn't have to turn to him, fortunately, but now they're in a situation where he is next man up, and Drew Aller's down to his final year of eligibility. So the spotlight is much bigger on Grunkemeyer. You had a story on him coming out of the Fiesta Bowl because that's where we first had a chance to speak with him during his freshman year. This was a bit of a kind of a catch-up after the fact. What were your takeaways this time around?
Yeah, I think the one thing I took away from talking to Ethan Grunkemeyer today is that he feels really confident and that he feels like he internalized everything that happened over the course of his freshman year, and has I guess has it in a position to help him as he moves forward. Tripping over my words a little bit, but I think he feels like he developed this year, and some of that is the infrastructure that they have in terms of Danny O'Brien, Andy Kotelnicki, James Franklin, working and advising the quarterbacks in different capacities. But Grunkemeyer was also really complimentary of Drew Aller. And he said that while Drew Aller coming back next year for his senior season, huge for Penn State, obviously, but it's also really big for Grunkemeyer in terms of getting another year to work behind Aller, watch him work, learn from him. He said the one thing that stands out to him about Aller is that he is always watching football. That on Sundays he's watching the NFL games. When Aller is walking around the Lash building, he's watching NFL games on his phone and watching these different quarterbacks. And Grunkemeyer said that he wants to learn how he can watch quarterbacks like that and take stuff away from it for his game. So basically, I think if you want to put it in a way that he wants to learn from how Aller learns, and he thinks that having Drew around for another year is going to help with that. We've covered it pretty in depth how these two guys go back a little ways to Ohio, their trainer Brad Mendler, and the relationship there. But it seems like Grunkemeyer feels confident of what he was able to learn and accomplish during his freshman year, and now he's trying to figure out how to take those next steps. And he thinks that having Aller around is going to be really big for that.
Someone who might be a little more obviously prevalent in the offensive discussion this year is Luke Reynolds, former 5-star tight end, burned his red shirt in 2024 as the number 2 tight end behind Tyler Warren. Number 2 tight end behind Tyler Warren early in the season. And then you had Khalil Dinkins back from his injury. Ultimately, he settled into that tight end 3 role for much of the year. We thought that was going to be a Dinkins-Rapplier situation. Rapplier was lost early in the year. We'll see where he's at going into 2025. But Reynolds is going to be part of that conversation to replace Tyler Warren, whether it's a collective effort, which we are anticipating, or a one-man show. And that would be quite the thing if anyone from this tight end room can command the kind of work that Tyler Warren got. I don't see that happening. But Luke Reynolds, man, he talked about going from 214.8 was what he weighed when he got in. He gave us a decimal point when he showed up to campus. Now he's solidly at 250. He's looking good wearing it. He said he's feeling good wearing it. It was an adjustment period because he's a good guy that was really able to rely a lot on some of his quickness downfield at the high school level. You're working against different opponents, even in the camp circuit. When he was at the national camp circuit, showing off against everybody. It's just a different feel when you're trying to outrace defensive backs in the Big Ten or even on Penn State's practice field. So when you're 35 pounds heavier, that was an adjustment, but naturally the physical part of it was a big plus for Luke Reynolds. We knew he had to earn his way onto the field as a blocker. Look, he said he will take a big-time catch down the field over a big-time block any day of the week. That's how he is wired. He's always going to be someone who wants to be out there running routes, catching the balls, but he knows the dirty work is part of the process. What I liked from him, though, Daniel, is I think we picked up some innate kind of outward leadership kind of vibes from him as a recruit. You never know how that's going to translate, but when a guy has that kind of demeanor, you think it could work out. It seems to be the case now that he's got a little under his belt. Tyler Warren's out of that room. He's starting to become one of the voices in that tight end room. He's doing his part. And he talked about all of a sudden there's new freshmen in town. They had a couple of them arrive in January. One of them is another guy who's a big-time talent, Andrew Olish. And he said he's taking Tyler Warren's approach with helping Andrew Olish along. He said when he got to campus, he was a 5-star guy, but he didn't think he knew everything. Still, Tyler Warren didn't force a lot down his throat. Tyler Warren didn't say, follow me like a puppy. Tyler Warren observed him, chimed in occasionally, helped steer him in the right direction. He said that's kind of what he's doing with Andrew Olish. He's letting him have his own room to go out there, experience Penn State for himself. But he says he'll be chiming in. He'll be giving him every direction he might need as spring practice moves forward. But I think it's a really good spot to have a personality like Luke Reynolds there. We know what he can be as an athlete, as a downfield pass target, but I think that tight end room's in a really good place right now, despite losing one of the greatest tight ends we've seen at the college football level, and I think he's a big part of that. And across the field, another defender that we got to see get out there for quite a bit of work, and in part because of an injury, this time to KJ Winston at safety, was Ja'Juan Seider. And he's a guy that we spoke about as much as any freshman, it felt like, aside from maybe Cooper Cousins last fall, because he kept coming up to James Franklin. We would say, do you feel confident Ja'Juan Seider could take that next step up? So maybe you can, move Jalen Reed back up to that line position. And again, it was really the Jalen Reed and Zachy Wheatley show back deep once KJ Winston went down. But the third safety, by and large, was Ja'Juan Seider, and now you've got two of these safeties, Winston and Reed, waiting to hear their name called in the NFL draft. Thus, bigger roles await likely.
I think in terms of grouping Reynolds and Lane together, one thing that really stood out to me about both of them, and I got the chance to talk to Lane for a while at the Fiesta Bowl. I think Mark talked to Reynolds, and the same held true today as it did then, but they both just seemed really at ease with us and talking to us, which, when you have some of these young guys and, they're talking to us for the first time, because Penn State keeps them, out of sight, out of mind a little bit to the media as true freshmen, you don't really know what you're going to get.
Daniel, I won't name names, but there was one individual today who I spoke with one-on-one for a bit, and he got better as it went on, but we hadn't spoken before. I don't know how many media interviews he did in high school, but it had been at least a year since his last interview. And the first few questions he was answering, I could hear him breathing so loudly. It was like he was trying to give a speech in front of a class for the first time. And you're right. We take this for granted. We're used to talking to guys like Drew Aller and Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, who've been in front of mics now for a long time. But it's a different thing when all of a sudden the mics and the cameras and everybody wants to ask you these questions, and that what you say is going to be potentially scrutinized by the staff and by your peers. And so all of a sudden you can play some mind games on yourself. So I do think it stands out when guys can sit here at a table with a bunch of beat reporters who they may or may not really know at all and seem at ease. I think you're right that there is something to be said. It doesn't separate good players from bad players, but it just gives you a little bit more insight into what that guy may be wired up as right now at 19 years old.
Yeah, I have to go back to find the exact wording and I think the exact context, but I think that I overheard Reynolds have a little quip about, he was like, oh yeah, like I'm glad I don't have to play quarterback anymore because of all the scrutiny and all the attention on everything you do. And then I was chatting with Ja'Juan Seider, and he went to the Gilman School in Baltimore, and their arch rival is McDonough, which we've heard a lot about over the past couple of years. So, I asked him, what's it like being around so many McDonough guys? And, he had a really good laugh at that. And, talked about all the trash that they talk in the locker room and everything like that. So, I thought that was really, an insightful beyond just, getting quotes, getting information that we will put, their words on the message board. It was, maybe a more, meta or more esoteric look at things. One thing you brought up with Reynolds in terms of the weight gain, when we get to talk to these freshmen for the first time, it's the best story, the easiest storyline to get. I know we did it last year with Tony Rojas in terms of his physical development. But yeah, you've got Luke Reynolds coming in at 214, getting up into the 240s. We both talked to Malachi Williams, who said he arrived at 210 and is at 255 now. Mm-hmm. I talked to Xavier Gilliam for a while. He said that he was up at he was at 260 when he got here. He said he's at 295 right now. I know he was listed up around, I think, at 302 at one point during the season. And he was kind of funny about it. He was like, yeah, I really have to manage it now. He said that, if he has one or two really big meals, that can mean 10 pounds for him. So I didn't ask what would be in those meals, but
really big meals. Yeah.
He said his go-to was mac and cheese at the training table. That was his favorite meal when he got here. But it's always really interesting to hear, from these guys about that physical development, because that's a really big part of this. That when outside of someone like, I don't know, like a Denied and a Sutton who
Cooper
shows up,
Cousins.
and Cooper Cousins, like
Yeah.
when those guys show up on campus and you see them and you're like, oh yeah, like this is it. Like I could have recruited them, I could have scouted them. But then you've got these other guys where you're trying to project, and especially, edge rushers, interior defensive linemen. It's like you're thinking, okay, what's this going to look like in a year, then 2 years, then 3 years? And, there's no such thing as a sure thing with some of it. And so to get positive feedback from some of these guys about taking to the strength program, taking to that development. We know Penn State's reputation. We know that Chuck Losey has done a really, really good job during his time here at Penn State. Franklin's entire tenure, that's really been a calling card, is that physical development. To get positive feedback on that from these young guys, and to hear them talk about going through these big changes and coming out on the other side, confident and still able to be the players they felt like they were in high school, I think is always notable.
Yeah, Malachi Williams, he said 45 pounds up. It told us his go-to was the salmon Alfredo that Penn State's been serving. He said really anything Alfredo, which is probably a good way to go if you got to put on 40 plus pounds. At DeAndre Cook, freshman defensive tackle, is another who told me I think 30 plus pounds put on during the first year. Kari Jackson, conversely, he's a guy who lost about 10 pounds at linebacker, trying to put himself in a better position to be versatile, to be able to play in space. So we're seeing different guys kind of evolve in their own ways in different position rooms, and really back on the practice field next month. Before then, of course, there's going to be a pretty arduous period of winter conditioning workouts, and it'll be an opportunity for a lot of these guys to maybe atone for some of the mistakes they made in that setting last year as true freshmen. Wanted to finish with some notes on Max Granville, because he's a guy that you wrote about down at the Orange Bowl when we thought he might just have to step up for Abdul Carter if he wasn't able to go against Notre Dame. Obviously, Carter went, showed why he might be the number one pick in the NFL draft, but he is gone now. And as we discussed earlier, Aman Vanover is not around anymore. So Max Granville becomes a name that we all need to really wrap our heads around. He was supposed to be a high school senior right now. He told us today he still might try to get down for his prom, but he ended up reclassifying last year, came to campus just a few days before preseason camp, and he ends up working his way in a position where the staff was prepared to burn his red shirt if necessary. It wasn't at that position. They were able to get a longer look at him during some playoff run when that red shirt rule no longer applied. And he gets to the point now where he said with the postseason reps that he got on the practice field, in game work, and he also said that they're easing the load off guys like Denied Dennis Sutton and Abdul Carter, and both those guys were dealing with injuries. He said he got a ton of work on the practice field late in the year. Right now, he feels like he is almost a veteran status, and I think that's a great thing to hear from a guy who played in 4 regular season games, doesn't have a lot of Big Ten work under his belt, because I'm telling you, Daniel, we probably had this conversation, or at least maybe me and Tyler Calvaruso did last summer when he all of a sudden jumped into that freshman class. He does have the goods. And maybe because he showed up to college a year earlier, it pushes him a year later in terms of his college impact. They didn't need his big impact next year. I think if they can get it the upcoming year as a 2-deep kind of component with what he brings you physically and mentally that we've heard, there's a lot to like about the composition of Matt Granville and how he can fit in with this lineage of edge rushers. Remember, Chop 2.0 was the nickname that we heard flying around during camp this year.
I think when you talk about Aman Vanover leaving and having that void in the rotation, and we know that Penn State expects to get Zariah Fisher back, and that there is some excitement about what he can do. But I think from where you stand right now, Granville is he's the guy with the ceiling. He's the guy that you can, like you said, Chop 2.0, that you can project out and really, kind of let your imagination run a little bit. And so I think this is a huge offseason for him. He's going to get his first taste of the winter conditioning. A lot of these guys we talked to today were here last winter, so they know what they're going to be in for a little bit during those. I think James Franklin said 6 sessions beginning later this month. But this is going to be new for him. He's going to get that full offseason program. And this is where I think that he can put himself in position to take that big step forward, to make that leap that, maybe if he, spends that last year in high school, that maybe he's at this point now. That didn't really make sense, but I think that he's in a point where he can take a big step forward. And I think that if you're Penn State, you want to see that from him this offseason, especially like we talked about. There's going to be a lot of reps up for grab on that defensive line.
In some ways, a great January of roster retention kind of takes some of that pressure off this class and some key positions, but there's places to fill. There's pieces that you need to improve upon if you want to go win a national championship, and 20 plus guys here to do that with. And on top of that, you just stacked on this other freshman class that started to show up during the playoff run, and all of a sudden these guys weren't the youngest in their position rooms anymore. That's just the tip of the iceberg, as we said. What was that, 5 or 6 names out of 20 plus freshman guys? So much coming your way at Lions247.com from these conversations, which we always appreciate getting the chance to do that. Mark Brennan was there. Grace Brennan was there. We'll have a ton of video, ton of photos. And as we work our way through the audio here, a lot of written content as well. Daniel, anything else to add? Did we miss anything? It has been, every show to show here, it's like I got to make sure, retrace my footsteps and like make sure we're not leaving anything out, because this offseason has been aggressive, man.
I mean, if you like some roster minutia, Antoine Belgrave Shorter is now number 3. He wore 23 last year as a true freshman. He said that he's a safety now. I know that he made that switch last year during the season. He said that that's sticking. And then I had a nice chat with Kenny Wosley, who is from Philadelphia, and was speaking about seeing Saquon Barkley and Jahan Dotson, play in the Super Bowl on Sunday night, win a Super Bowl. What that means to him as a young Penn State player, even though he's not an Eagles fan. He told us he's a Panthers fan because of Cam Newton. But he's from Philly, so he knows what it means for the city, and to see players from Penn State kind of representing for his city. It sounded like it really resonated with him. So we'll have a lot coming out. I mean, great. I had a great conversation with Xavier Gilliam. I'm excited to write that up. Enjoyed the insight. Tyseer Denmark was someone else too that we'll write about, because we know there's a lot of curiosity about the wide receiver room. So it's going to be I think a fun couple of weeks for what we're writing on Lions 24/7.
And just to add to the curiosity out there, how about the guy that we've heard referred to as a unicorn, former high school quarterback turned offensive tackle, Garrett Sexton? We caught up with him as well for a while on his emergence as a 290-plus pound tackle who has ambitions to go attack a spot on the 2 deep this year. So there's a lot of cool stories that we'll get into over the site. For now, we're going to step aside from the podcast. We'll be back with a second episode this week. We'll see what we have to chat about. Again, follow the Penn State running back coach search over at Lions247.com. Check out those names that we put together to monitor along the way. And as those developments come, we'll break them down over at the site and eventually here on the podcast. On behalf of Daniel Gowan and our entire coverage team at Lions247, I am Tyler Donahue. Thanks as always for tuning in to the Lions247 podcast.